All right, welcome. Here, we're going to get started. I'm really excited. I want to start by just talking about Serverpod. I have done some content on Serverpod in the past, and obviously in this series we will be touching on a lot more than I've even covered because we have to build a lot in the backend. So Serverpod, we think of it as a Dart-based backend, but it's a little bit more than that. There are Dart-based backends. There's things like Dart Shelf and Frog and various other ones. The main thing that Serverpod does differently is, firstly, it's meant to specifically work with Flutter, although you can make it work with other things. You're not going to get all the power without using Flutter on the front end, because what it does is it generates, based on your models and your configuration, it generates a lot of code for you so that the Flutter app can talk to the backend, and essentially the backend can talk to the front end without thinking about what you normally would do. If you've ever built a traditional, full stack application that is decoupled, meaning you have a backend, maybe a Node or Django, and you have a front end in Flutter or React, a lot of the work is building that API. It's that communication between the two things. And Serverpod kind of just does that for you. And that's one of the great things about it. There's plenty of other great things we'll see. So let's get started here. First thing I want to do is just make sure I have the most up-to-date version, and I can do this or install it if I don't have it already by just running dart pub global activate serverpod _ CLI. So this is like the Dart package that's kind of like the orchestrator of Serverpod to run various commands and generate code and all that kind of stuff. So I'm at 2.0.1, awesome. Next thing, well, it tells us we can run Serverpod to make sure it's good, but I know it's good, we're fine. So let's go to the getting started. You'll see this thing Mini. Mini's a cool new version of Serverpod that if you don't want to have a database or Redis or all these like bigger architecture things, you can have a very simple slimmed down version. I have done a series on this too, and it's pretty cool, but it's not going to meet our use case. We definitely want a database for this. So we're just going to do the normal Serverpod create, and we're just going to call it open mic. Again, the name of this project is still to be determined, but we'll call it this for now so that it has a name. We need something. So we're going to do that. And this will do a bunch of things. It's going to create some folders for us, some files. It's going to install some dependencies, all that good stuff. All right, so you'll see I have now a folder called OpenMic, the name that I made it, and we're going to open this in VS Code. All right, I'm going to make stuff bigger so we can see it. Now you'll see we have 3 different folders here, aside from the .github folder, which we'll talk about far in the future. So we have the server, which is our backend code. We have the Flutter app, and this is aside from some changes they made to the example app to make it work with Serverpod. It's basically just an example Flutter project. Like if you look at the main.dart, it's pretty similar. We have our main app, we have our home page. It's just laid out differently because it's not doing a counter app, it's doing something else, which I'll show you. So that's the Flutter side. If you've done anything in Flutter, nothing crazy there. That's different. On the server, we have some cool things going on. So first of all, we have a Docker file, and that's going to allow us for deployment and specifically a Docker compose file for local development that will actually spin up our Postgres database and our Redis server. Really nice way to work, and we'll see that in a minute. We have all the other normal Dart things. We have a pubspec YAML, all that kind of stuff. We have a bin main.dart, and this is really just how we start our server. We don't need to write any code in here. It's basically just going to bootstrap based on our server file right here. So this is a server file. This is right inside right inside lib. We have server.dart. And this is essentially configuring different modules that we're going to have. You can also create web routes, and they have some examples in here. We may find a use for this, we might not, so they might get removed, but we'll keep it for now. And then it just kind of does start. And this is, once this is starting and running, it's listening, and the server is running, and it's great. It's going to do stuff for us. In the source directory, we have endpoints. That's for creating API endpoints. Future calls. This is actually a really cool feature that I've used but never actually shown in a tutorial. It allows you to essentially say, hey, I want to run a function, whether that's send an email or a welcome email or something like that, but I want to send it in 5 hours, or I want to send it on this date. And the way they do it, I think, is really smart. A lot of times with things like Celery, with like delayed tasks and stuff, it's using Redis to store that task. But if you restart your Redis or your server goes down, you have to restart it, all that stuff usually will get lost unless you've like configured in a way to to do it, but that's a lot of DevOps, a lot of complications. They actually, Serverpod stores in the database. So you'll never, assuming you don't wipe your database, you're never going to lose these sort of tasks. And this is something we probably will use because in our app, we might want to remind people like that there's this event coming up. So when they subscribe to the event, we can kind of like make a future call that says, okay, on this date, like just send this email. Really easy. Generated, we don't ever have to touch. This is code that gets generated based on our configuration. Models, so our models aren't actually Dart code. They're just YAML files where you configure stuff. And we'll be doing a lot of that. And you'll see it's .spy.yaml. And at first, I didn't understand what that was. It was something that came out in 1 point something. And I was like, why is there this .spy thing? What is that? And it just stands for Serverpod YAML. And it's really just so that if you install the Serverpod extension, so you'll see I actually have the Serverpod extension installed. It can look for files that are .spy.yaml and actually add the proper coloring, and it can add some IntelliSense and linting and all that kind of stuff. So that's all that is. Web is if we want to make our own like a web API, or sorry, I think web is actually for static. Yes, web. This is if you wanted to actually host in Serverpod like a standard like web application, HTML, that kind of stuff. We won't be doing that, so we can kind of ignore that folder. All right, so that's kind of the little overview of the server folder. And then the client side, in the client, this is also something aside from installing packages we want to use in the pub spec, we're not going to touch anything really in here. This gets generated based on our server, and it's really cool. And then Flutter doesn't talk to the server directly. It talks to the client code, and the client code knows how to interface with the server and kind of like back and forth. So that's basically where we're at. That's Serverpod in a nutshell. Seeing it in action will be exciting. So let's kind of start to see it in action, I guess. First thing we want to do is we want to get our database running. And like I showed you before, if we cd into the server directory, we can run something with our Docker Compose. And to do that, you actually just do Docker Compose. And then we want to say --build --detach. Docker Compose. Sorry, I missed one thing. Docker Compose up. We're telling it, hey, we want the Docker image to go up, meaning like we want it to be available and running. And we want to say we want to build it because it's our first time. It's actually going to build some stuff for us. And we want to detach because otherwise it will keep running in this terminal, and we'll have to keep this terminal running to have it going. I don't want to do that. I just want it to kind of be separated. So we're going to run this. And now you'll see, okay, it created OpenMic server. If you're trying this at home, you have to have Docker running, so make sure you install it. It's free. So let's just go to it. I did already have it running, and here's all my Docker containers right now, but here's it, OpenMic server, and you'll see in here we have both Postgres, which is our database, and Redis. And Redis is going to be used for caching. It's going to be used, there's probably other things that Serverpod uses it for under the hood, maybe logging and stuff like that. I'm not totally sure, but it is part of the architecture. Unless you're using Serverpod Mini, then you don't get any of this stuff, and it's just simpler. But we want these things, and it's great. This is only meant for a development environment. You wouldn't use this on your server. You wouldn't just install stuff sort of properly, but for development it is perfect. And you can see I use it on lots of projects, not just Serverpod specific projects. Okay, so now we have that. Let's go back to our lovely docs. So you'll see we had this Docker Compose build attach, detach. Now what we want to do is run. So inside server, there is a bin and a main.dart. We are going to actually run it. And to run it, we just go dart bin main.dart. Now, specifically, what we want to do here is actually apply migration. So we can go -- apply migrations. And what this will do is it's going to take any database migrations that came with Serverpod, because we haven't done anything yet. We kind of just have Serverpod. And I'm seeing a little bit of an issue here. One sec. All right, I think it's just because I just started up Docker. Let's just try apply migrations again. This seems better. So basically what it did, it applied this migration. This was an auto-generated migration. And what are migrations? So migrations are essentially a way to, in code and in configuration files, manage the your database structure, the data in it, that kind of thing. And allows you to, start with, say, you have a model that has like, maybe a user has like a name and an email, but later you want to add a bio, and it's a way we can actually like tell tell Serverpod that, hey, we're adding this new field. We don't want to wipe everything and like have to run the SQL from scratch. It's just like commands to be like, okay, add this table or add this field or alter this field. It's a pretty common thing in backends. Django has a great migration system. Ruby on Rails, various other backends do as well. And without this, Serverpod wouldn't be nearly as good. And I was really excited when this feature launched because it was a big missing piece when their like initial version came out. And now we've had migrations now maybe for almost a year, I think. Yeah, it's great. And you don't have to really understand how it all works. You can kind of see like what they do under the hood to give a definition of a certain table, as well as the SQL that would actually run, and so on and so forth. So we just had to run that, and you don't have to worry if you accidentally, did I run them? Like you can run them multiple times because it knows the state of the last one run, and it won't try and run it. Like you'll see here, latest database migration already applied. So we're safe, we're good. Okay, cool. So we have that now. And let's now, try to run our app. Actually, we are running it just by doing that. So let's just run it. And we're running our backend. Let's go to the Flutter app itself. So let's go to flutter main.dart. And we'll just switch this to make sure we're using the iPhone simulator. You can use anything. You can use Mac OS, although with Mac and Windows, you have to configure your entitlements to allow network, as you would not just with Serverpod, but any app that needs to access a network. But we're going to be using the iPhone simulator for the most part through here until we get to doing stuff specifically for web and obviously for Android. So I'm just going to click run here, and we'll let that start up. All right. So our app is started. We have it here. So this is the example app in Serverpod, and let's just play around with it. My name is Tyler. Send to server. Hello, Tyler. Obviously, this is something you could do without a backend. It's just really an example. But what's happening here is I'll walk you through it. So first of all, in the main.dart, we have accessing the client. So this client, this is actually part of Serverpod. You'll see it's some generated code that came from the OpenMic client. So this other folder here. And we sort of bootstrap it saying connect on this local host, which this is just a constant, which if you click, it goes like that. And on this specific port, because that's where our database, or our server rather, is running. It's running on port 8080. In here, if we go through, we're going to see we talk to the client. To call hello, we talk to the client, specifically in the example endpoint. And we call the method hello, passing in whatever text we had in that. And if we go to the server side, we'll go into endpoints, and we'll see there's one called example_endpoint. And there's a function called hello that you can, match here. And you'll see in here, first of all, in any endpoint, the first parameter is always going to be session. And this is something, I like to consider this almost like the build context of server side. It's similar in some ways, obviously a lot different as well. But it's something that, essentially Serverpod and stuff, required to do things with. In this example, we're not making use of session, but you could do things like get the authenticated user, log something, all these, get access to the database, all these kinds of things. You'll notice, though, that we never pass the session in. In fact, we're only passing one parameter because we're not actually calling this directly. We are calling this generated code that gets generated for us, and it omits the first option because this is something that the client doesn't have access to, and obviously it can't pass up. So we're passing up the name. This is a future string, so it's async, and it's going to return hello and then the name. Of course, we could decide to put some exclamation marks here. Now you'll notice, I'm going to click this again. This again. We didn't get the change there. And that's because when we're making changes to the server, we have to restart it when we're making any code changes to the server. So I'm just going to click Control-C and run this again. We don't really need to run it with apply migration, so we'll take that out. And let's now hit it again. Now I don't have to restart the Flutter app or anything. I can just hit this again, and we'll see we got the different change back. So that's kind of cool. How that could work. So very basic example, but we are seeing, the client talk to the server processing the data and responding, with something. Now this is returning a string in this example, but you can return not anything, but anything that can really be serialized, which we'll see. So, maps, lists, other models that we'll be making. So it's really powerful, and you don't have to think about, so much about like serializing and deserializing. In fact, you don't really have to think about it at all. It automatically is going to happen for you. So that's kind of the power of Serverpod in a nutshell. And there's a lot more to it. We're going to be making use of basically everything it has to offer over the next many hours of this series. Okay, so let's talk about Auth. I think that's the first logical thing to get out of the way. It's, to me, a lot of the time it's not the most exciting thing. It's like, oh, authentication, yay, logging in, logging out, creating accounts, updating your profile, all these like sort of things. But it is a pretty important part of any app that at least has Auth. It's a very important part of it, and a lot of your logic and stuff is going to rely on who's the user or are they logged in. So we're going to just get it out of the way now. I think we are good here. We're going to go to now something in the docs called modules. And we're going to follow this installation. For the example that they give you for modules is actually the auth module, so it's kind of perfect. So we want to install to this server, Serverpod auth server. So we'll just stop the server. We're going to have to restart it anyways. Might as well stop it. We'll clear some stuff up. And in the server directory, we're going to go dart pub add and paste that in. Notice it's not Flutter pub add. This is not a Flutter project. This is just a Dart project, so we use dart pub add. Now, we're installing this module, and you'll see it installed, we already had Serverpod 2.0.1. Now, because of the way pub add works, it will generally put this caret here. And what that means is it will use this version, or it'll use a newer version within, that's like a non-breaking change of the semantic versioning. Now, for this exact case, I think it's a good practice, and I read stuff about this, I think, on Serverpod docs, that we should get rid of the caret and make sure that they're always exactly the same. We don't want a different version of auth server than Serverpod. They have to stay synced. Otherwise, like, they might have made a change here that they didn't, or they might have made a change in this one that we get the upgrade for, but we didn't upgrade this. Anyways, do that. It'll save you some headaches. And then if we ever want to say 2.0.2 comes out, we would go in and update both sort of manually. And I've noticed they always put these different packages out at the same time, all their official packages. They never like, oh, we released Serverpod 3, but it's still auth server 2. Like, that's not going to happen. It hasn't happened. Okay, so we'll do that. Then what we can also do is because this is kind of a long name, it's like Serverpod auth server. I don't want to be like typing that in our code. And for modules, you can actually give them an alias. So in our config.generator, we're just going to paste in what's in the docs, modules Serverpod auth. We're going to call it just auth. And that'll allow us in our code just to reference it as auth and make our lives a little bit easier. Okay, so we'll do that. Then we're going to run this. I don't think we have to run this because we've already done the install, but I'm just going to follow it verbatim. Hey, look, it got some things. Cool. And then we're going to run Serverpod generate. And this is an important thing. This is something we're going to run a lot. And this basically looks at the server code and says, OK, I need to make some changes and actually generate some stuff over here. And it's weird. We have an error now over here, which actually makes sense. And you'll see why in a bit. But we need to make sure we do that. Then, because now there's this new module, there's going to be some migration or some data changes that come with it, because the auth module comes with some new models that we didn't have before, things like the user info and various other things. So what we want to do is, with that new code that is part of our module, we want to run serverpod create migration. And this is going to create a new migration. And if we actually go to the migrations folder here, that was the one we already installed, and there's the new one. And you could go through and see what they did, see what this actually does. If we look at the migration, we're seeing it's creating a table called Serverpod auth key with a bunch of to like a hash and method and scope name. Cool. You get the idea. Go through it all you want, but it works. Then we've created the migration, but we haven't actually ran it against our database, and that's what that apply migrations does. So we want to run that. All right, we are applying migrations. Cool. Now, the reason we have this error here, and if we actually look at it, it'll probably make a little bit of sense. There's stuff in here like saying import Serverpod auth client as this and whatever. We need to also, according to the docs, install this on the client. So we're going to do the same kind of thing, except we're going to get out of the server directory and go into the client directory. And we're just going to do dart pub add. Now, we're not installing the exact same package. We're kind of installing its sibling, Serverpod auth client instead of Serverpod auth server. So let's do that. And astute viewers will probably think, hey, shouldn't we do that same thing we did before where we get rid of the caret? Yes. Yes, we should. And let's just do a dart pub get again, so we make sure we get that version, even though this is the latest. We just want to make sure we're good. Okay, cool. So we now have that. And if we now, yeah, that error is gone because it has that package, wherever, I forget which file it was in, one of these, it was giving us an error. Doesn't matter. It's gone. There's no errors now. We have no problems. Life is good. So now on the Flutter side, there's 3 packages we could install. Now, we're not going to worry about signing in with Google or Apple yet. It will come at some point, but I don't want to deal with the whole configuration of those sorts of things. We will be doing that in this project, but for now, we're just going to worry about email, and that comes with the auth shared Flutter. So we will grab that, and we will go back a directory and into the Flutter directory, and this time we'll do Flutter, not Dart, pub add our Serverpod auth shared Flutter. And let's open up our Flutter pubspec.yaml. And I think you know what's about to happen. We're going to change this to this. I'm also going to move this just up here because it's kind of like, in my opinion, this is all like Serverpod things. We have Serverpod Flutter, which is just the Flutter package that knows everything about Serverpod. We have the client. You'll see the client gets imported not as a package. It's getting imported as ... meaning back a directory into here. So that's kind of cool. And then we have this right here. So we're keeping those the same. And in fact, I'm going to put these right here just so that when we're going in and changing these, because I bet, honestly, probably a few times throughout this series, we'll be like, oh, look, Serverpod has a new version. Let's update and test everything. So let's keep those beside each other. And I'm also going to do just a Flutter pub get just to make sure we are for sure on 2.0.1. All right, so that's it for that module setup. Luckily, they used authentication as the example, so it just made it a lot easier. But let's go to authentication now. And there's some stuff in here we've already done, some we haven't. Okay, so we need to go to our server.dart. So let's just close everything, Command-K. Go to our server, go to our, where is it again? Lib server.dart. So what we want to do is actually, first of all, import our auth package. And they suggest importing it with the alias auth, which to me makes perfect sense. Because then in here, we have to pass in an authentication handler. So we'll do authentication handler, and we just go to our auth alias. And what we want to pass in is the authentication handler. And this is just a built-in function that comes with the Serverpod auth server package. Okay, so we've done that. Then we want to configure some things about this. We've already done I'm kind of breezing through because I know I've done these things. We've done these things. We run the generate. We've created migrations. We've done our, compose, but we also want to do some configuration of auth. So I'm going to copy this, and right before we start the pod, we can config some stuff. A lot of cool options in here that we can do, but the main thing we want to worry about now is the way Serverpod works, and it's just a good practice, and many, even a lot of BASs, backend as a service, have this set by default. When someone signs up, we want to send them an email and be like, send them a code, and they can confirm their account so that people can't just set up accounts randomly with emails that aren't real. That's built into Serverpod. It's really good, but we have to configure it to actually send the email. Serverpod's not going to send the email for us. So for that, we have a send validation email. And this is just a function. If we looked at it enough, eventually, you'll see that it's a function that the session, email, and validation code are the parameters for. So let's make those. Session, email, and the validation code. Do they call it validation code or verification code? Validation code. So we'll call it that too. And it's an asynchronous function, as we kind of saw here. Async, cool. So we'll conform to that. And basically here is where we would, in the future, want to write our logic to go, okay, AWS or SendGrid or whatever we're using to send an email, some SMTP server, send an email to this email address with this validation code. However, we're not ready to set that up yet. Nowhere ready to set that up yet. So we're going to just print out whatever the code is. So let's just do like code. And here we can go validation code. And we want to, this has to either return true or false, because it will allow, maybe when we do the request to our server, if an error happens, we can say, hey, something went wrong, like return false. But we know this is going to go true. Like the print's going to work. I'm pretty confident. While we're here, we can also do something very similar. There's a thing for doing a password reset that they handle. And we're just going to do the exact same thing, just print it out to our console. All right. We have that set up. and good to go. Let's just start the server. So let's make sure we get back to our Serverpod directory, and then we can go dart bin main.dart and just run it and make sure everything kind of starts up, and we're good. Okay, cool. So our server is in pretty good shape. Our client is totally fine. We've generated. Now let's focus a bit on the Flutter side. So we're going to go to lib, and we're just going to do a quick little semi-setup of some architecture that we're going to use. In our lib folder, I'm going to make a new folder called core. This is going to be kind of like our core, where all of our core stuff with our app goes that isn't feature specific. We're also going to have a folder called features, and a feature to me is anything that we're going to have a model for a lot of the time. So in our app that we're building, like venue is going to be a feature, user is going to be a feature, event, post, like all these kinds of things. So we're going to have that there. I also want to make a new folder just for the future called theme. Okay, cool. Inside features, we're going to start by making an auth feature. And inside here, we're going to make a bunch of folders. Now, something we can do if we want, I'm just going to make this tiny and make this one big. Just because doing it in VS Code could be a little bit slower. I have to like keep right-clicking and all this kind of stuff. Let's just go into the Flutter app, lib, and inside the feature directory. Now in here, I can actually go, or let's go inside the auth directory. Here, I can actually do make directory components, for example. And you'll see a components folder got made. That's just a little bit faster to me. And I mean, the real benefit of doing this, we can actually make multiple folders this way. We can go make directory. We want to have providers. We want to have models. I'm just putting spaces between them. We're going to want services. And we're going to want screens. And that's mostly it for what we're going to want on a feature by feature. So I'll in the first video and like the intro video, I kind of mentioned we're not using full-on clean architecture here. It's overkill. Getting an MVP to market, it just doesn't make sense. This isn't a project that a bunch of people are going to work on, and I'm set on this backend. I'm not like, oh, I want to change it at some point. That being said, I am planning on keeping this really clean and solid, and it's going to be great. And this really works well with my mindset, and I'm using it on many projects, at least a variant of it. So components are where like widgets would go. Models are like, you know, where our data sort of driven things go. Providers, that's where all of our like state management sort of stuff will live. A lot of good work will go into there. Screens, that's pretty obvious. And services, this is kind of like if you've done clean architecture, I'm using the word service. It's kind of the combination of the repository and the data source is what's going to live in there. So let's start by making a service because we need it. We're going to call this auth service. Dart. And we will try to not make as many typos moving forward. So in our auth service, we'll just make a class called auth service. And our auth service, when it is essentially being used, we need access to two different things in this case. One is that fancy thing called client. So we'll just go client, and we should get that auto importing, and we'll just call it client. Now this is, if we go to the main.dart in Flutter, basically we want to instance this. So the way they do it in the example is they just have this global variable here and whatever, but that's not really a nice tidy way of doing it. We're going to construct our own at some point, and we're going to pass it through. Secondly, we're going to have something called a session manager, which comes with the auth package. You'll see that it got auto imported here. If you didn't install the auth package, you won't ever find this. So we're going to need those to happen, to be basically injected in. And we're just going to do create constructor here for these. I'm going to slightly modify it. I just want to do these as ordered parameters as opposed to name parameters. Or arguments, or whatever you want to call them. So when we construct an auth service, we need to pass these things in. Okay, cool. Now our auth service is going to have, let's start with the creating an account, okay? And we'll get into, because we could do login first, but we need like an account first in order to even test logging in. So it makes sense to create an account first. So in order to do this, right now our only real package is like our Serverpod specific thing. So we need to install a few things here. So let's go, I have some things already open and ready to go to make this easier. like I said in the intro video, we're using riverpod. I love riverpod, and I really hope that people don't turn it off now that are like super like block, block, block. I also like block. Nothing wrong with it. I'm not going to get in an argument about it. What's better, what's worse. This just really works with my mindset, and I have a lot of experience with it. So I really hope, that it's not a turn off for the series, because like, sure, we're going to be doing some stuff in riverpod, but we're also doing a lot of things that are not state management specific. So stick around, hang out. Maybe you'll even be like, oh, actually, riverpod's pretty cool now that I understand it. Because I do, and I've heard people say this on the Reddit and stuff, like the docs for riverpod are a bit confusing. It took me a while to, especially when the new sort of like, I guess 2.0 and on came out, to really like understand what I should be doing now versus what I was doing before. I also want to mention just another one little last thing over riverpod. Like if you're using block, you're already using provider. Like block uses provider on the hood. Riverpod was made by the same developer as provider, and is not just like an alternate. It is the next version of provider. So I mean, you're already using Remy's work. If you're using freeze, you're also using Remy's work, and like just use riverpod. But nothing wrong with block. You've seen it if you watch my series. I've done some stuff on block. It's fine. Cool. So to install riverpod, we're going to get all these things. Two of them. One of them is just Flutter riverpod, which will install riverpod as well underneath the hood. Riverpod annotation will allow us to use like generation stuff. And then we have some dev dependencies. So let's just paste these all in and realize we're in the wrong folder. Although it's, I guess, VS Code or the Dart CLI is smart enough to know, okay, go back a few directories. Yeah, it says it changes the dependencies 3 directories back. I've never actually done that before. Cool. So we can do it anywhere. So it's installing all these lovely things for us and getting, the latest stable versions. So that gets us riverpod out of the way. Now, we also, although we need a few more things, and let me actually just go back to my main directory here. We also need to install do. Actually, sorry, we don't need to install do. We might need do for some things, but with Serverpod, we don't actually need do because the client itself is our networking client. Cool. We don't have to worry about that. But let's do a Flutter pub add fpdart. fpdart is basically functional programming in Dart. If you've heard of darts with a Z or a Z if you're in Canada, a lot of people, I think, use that. However, unless recently things have changed, it was not really as maintained of a package, whereas fpdart is contributed to a lot more often. And I've heard people say, like, just use that. And that's what I use. This allows us to do really cool things that we'll see in actually just a moment. Okay, so we have those installed out of the way. And in fact, by just a moment, I mean right now, because we're going to create a function called register with email. And the reason I'm saying register with email is we don't want to, we want to specifically say it's with email because we're going to allow people to register with Apple and Google and maybe other things in the future. So we want to just make this specific. And what this is going to return, well, first of all, it's going to be a future because it's going to be something that is asynchronous. It's not going to return right away. We're going to have to wait. But what we actually want to return here is something called an either. Either comes from the fpdart package. And either allows us to pass in through the generic 2 different things. On the left, when something goes wrong, what do we get back? And in this case, we're just going to send a string back that will be likely the error message. On the right, what will come back? In this case, when you register, nothing will actually come back. We're just going to do void, but this could be like a user would come back or a bool. And you'll understand with Serverpod why we don't really need anything in this case at this moment, but we'll just do void for that. So it's basically like, okay, it's a future, but it's going to either return a string or void, and we'll be able to know, is it the left that came back or is it the right based on the way it works. Now in here, what do we need to register with an email? So we're going to have a string of obviously the email address. We're going to have a string of the password, and we're also going to have a string of the username, which is something, at least the way we have Serverpod configured out of the box, is required when you create an account. It's async. And here, we're going to do some stuff. So this is going to be our first little bit of Serverpod code here. We're going to go final result equals await. And we're going to take that client. So we go client dot modules, because the code that we want to access is inside a module that we installed. It's not our own custom code. And we specifically look at the auth module. And within auth, there's actually things for Apple, for email, for Firebase, for Google, all that kind of stuff. But we want to look inside the email namespace. And here we run create account request. Now this is an account request. It's not actually creating the account because we don't want to actually create the account until they do the confirmation, and that's what this really is for. So here we must pass in the username, email, and password. Awesome. And this right here is going to return either true or false. So what we want to do is if result, we can go if not result, meaning result was false, where you want to say something went wrong. And in that case, we're going to return left. So denoting like it's the left side of this little little thing right here. And here we have to return a message. And in this case, we're just going to say could not create account. Not sure exactly what went wrong, but this failed and whatever. And all that's good, but there's other things that could go wrong, right? Like maybe the internet went out or who knows. So we're going to actually wrap this in a try catch to catch other potential problems. And in here, if something goes wrong, we're going to return left again. And this time we have a little bit of context. We have this error, so we can actually do e.toString. Now this message might not be user-friendly, but at least as we're developing this, we can kind of see. It might also be helpful just to print out this error and also to print out the stack trace. And in a catch parameter, the second optional parameter is stack trace, or I call it st because I don't want to write stack trace. And that'll actually give us a lot more info about the error and specifically what called it. Now we're still seeing this problem here. It's saying body might not complete normally because we actually haven't handled the success part of this. And in this case, so say it wasn't, we got past here, meaning the result was not null or was not false. It was true. Here we're going to return right, and I'm just going to pass null in here. All right, cool. So really we're just telling, whatever we're going to interface with, the caller of this, that if right comes back, there's no data. Like we could, of course, send true back. We could make this a Boolean, and that would be totally fine. But we're never returning false. So to me, it just kind of makes sense in this case to just, okay, cool. Let's just return void, but we'll be able to catch it. Okay, so we have a register with email. Now, a few other things to get out of the way. We need a couple providers, or actually probably a few. First of all, we don't want to be making, in our main.dart, where we have, this client, we don't want to be making new instances of this all the time. We want a singleton that represents this. So inside core, we're actually going to make a new folder called providers. We'll probably end up having, also screens and all that sort of stuff in here, but we'll just keep it like this. And we're going to have something just called client provider.dart. And here, we are going to have our first little bit of riverpod. So we're not creating a state notifier here or like a feature provider. We're just creating like a basic provider, which allows us to easily have a singleton. So we're going to call this client provider, and it's going to be a provider, which we can import. And when we have a provider in riverpod, we have to say what it is, and it's going to be of type client. And this is, of course, the same client we're talking about here and the same one that we're talking about here. Inside here, we're going to have access to ref. In riverpod, ref is kind of like the way we can access other providers. So we have access to it. We might not need it in certain cases, but it's the first parameter, so we keep it. And here we have to actually return the thing that we want to return. So I'm just going to actually take the code from here. We don't really need the variable, but we essentially want to return client right here. I'm also just I'm just going to make this localhost. Eventually, this will be something we make configurable in our environment. And we have to, of course, import this, put a semicolon there, and I'm just going to clean this up. Now, there's one other thing that we need with our client provider because we've added auth, which I think I might have skipped over in the docs. But in our client, we also need to make a reference to our authentication key manager, how we're going to store any of our auth keys. And that's just a parameter called authentication key manager. And we're going to use the Flutter authentication key manager right here. Just instantiate like that. Put a comma here to make it pretty. And here we have our lovely client provider. Similarly, while we're at it, I'm going to copy this because it'll be pretty similar. We're also going to have a session manager provider, which is going to represent, what gets passed into here. So we'll call this session manager provider. And instead of being of type client, we're going to auto import in session manager right there. Now, we obviously don't want to return a client. We want to return a session manager. Now, the session manager has one required Session manager has one required parameter, which is caller. And this we have to reference essentially our client here. Now we don't want to grab the client from main. We're actually going to be removing this. Instead, we're going to access the provider using ref.read. And here we want to actually import in our client provider. So that gives us access to the client itself. However, we don't want the client. We want essentially the modules.auth. If that doesn't make much sense, this is all, I mean, essentially in the docs to, how to actually construct the session manager. The only difference here that I'm doing is using riverpod and being able to actually access it through this singleton this way. Okay, so now we have these sorts of things, which is really nice. And we have our lovely auth service, at least the register with email. Let's do one more thing in our auth service. I'm going to copy and paste this. It's going to be pretty similar. And for this one, this is going to be confirm email registration. So this is where we're going to capture that code that is essentially going to email to someone. And to do this, instead of create account request, we're going to use create account, which takes two parameters. It takes the email and the verification code. So we'll just go like this. We'll change this to verification code. And right here, we can still have email, but we'll make this one verification code. So we're saying we have to return in an email or a verification code. Now, our result here is no longer, this isn't a Boolean, this is returning a nullable thing called user info. So in this case, we want to check if the result equals null, then maybe we do something where we error it out saying, yeah, could not create the account. However, there's actually something we can do a little bit more interesting in this. And I'm just going to copy this from another project that I have with Serverpod and walk you through it just because it's a little bit tedious to sort of type out, but it's pretty basic. But you'll see within result, and I'm just going to actually, we're going to say if result equals null, yeah. So inside result, we actually have something called result dot, what's it actually, fail reason. Wait, something is weird here. Oh, you know what? That's actually not correct. The thing I was thinking of, fail reason, is actually something that happens when you log in. So we'll get to that in the future. So here we're fine. If the result is null, we assume this. But if not, we don't want to return void. We actually want to return this user info. So user info. Now, we might not get the auto import for this. I sometimes have issues. Sometimes putting it here, you get the little thing. Sometimes clicking the light bulb, you'll get it. But in this case, we don't. But we can import this ourselves. So this actually just comes from, and to figure this out, just so you know, like if you do Control and Alt, you can kind of see actually what this is, and click on this, go to definition, and we'll see this comes from our Serverpod client. So let's just make sure we're including our Serverpod client, and we should have this thing called user info. So import package Serverpod, not Serverpod auth client, but Serverpod client / client.dart. Right there, saying it's unused, and that's because, oh, maybe I didn't get this from the right place. Serverpod auth client, I think it actually is Serverpod auth client. There we go. And now here, we actually have user info going to this right here. All right, so our user info is something we're going to return, and we're not going to make it nullable because we're going to return an error if it was null. If not, the user will definitely come back. So in this case, this is actually a right here, and we can just return it because we've already said if it's null, we're going to short circuit out and get out of here. So Dart and the compiler and everything knows that this is no longer null. We don't have to even put an exclamation mark, even though we could. It already knows it can't be null. Okay, cool. So that basically deals with our sort of things here. Now, we're not going to be talking to our auth service just by, we want to have a singleton for auth service too, mostly because we don't want to have to keep passing these things through. So inside auth, inside providers, we're going to make something called auth service provider. It's not auth provider, but auth service provider, because we want to provide the auth service itself. And in here, we're going to make something called auth service provider, which is going to be of type provider, just like we've done before. So I'll just pick any of these. And we're going to say what type it is. So it's going to be of type auth service. And here we get access to the ref again, which we will definitely need here because we want to return the auth service, but we need to pass in the client and session manager. And to get these, we can go ref.read client provider. That is going to be the client. And here we go, ref.read session manager provider. And now we're conforming to everything we need. We put a couple semicolon, we put a nice little comma here, make it pretty, and everything's good. Okay, so let's go to our UI. And for now, although we'll be breaking this up into a little better architecture, let's get rid of this. We're no longer using this. And that's going to give us some errors because all this stuff is relying on that client. So we're going to get rid of all this example code. It's all gone, example code. And for now, we're just going to have a scaffold like this. Now, a couple things that we haven't done yet with riverpod. Although we've created Serverpod stuff, we haven't actually fully set it up. There's two things I want to do. One, and this is just in the riverpod docs, we can actually go into our analysis options for Flutter. And right at the very bottom, we're actually going to put in a custom linter. When we installed riverpod, we installed this custom lint package, which is actually made also by the creator of riverpod and freezed and provider. What we want to put in here is a plugin. We're going to use analyzer. So right at the root, we're not within linter. We're just right at the start, analyzer, plugins, custom lint. And when we do that, we'll actually, throughout our code, see some specific riverpod linting that's kind of nice to have. And let's see if I can trick it to show up. Sometimes it takes a bit to come, but we should have an error happening there. However, while we're here, there's something else I want to do. I want to, in our rules, we can just get rid of this comment, but I want to put these two rules in. Prefer const constructors false and prefer const literals to create immutables false. This is something I highly recommend doing in early development. It's not something I recommend having before you go live. You'll want to take these away or put them to true because these are actually really good linters. But they get in the way of development sometimes. For instance, let me just show you what I mean. If I turn this off, for example, we actually start to see, oh my gosh, like there's this like error here, right? It's like this should be a const. But that gets in the way when you're coding, when you know that something isn't going to be a const for much longer. You might still be typing it out and you're seeing this in your way. Or you might be using fake data, that mock data, that is eventually going to become dynamic. So I highly recommend these two things. Again, just when you're starting and building, but definitely turn it on and closer to when you want to actually start testing the app, because doing const is a really good idea for making things more efficient. So we have that in there, which is nice. Now, what am I getting here? So this is the custom linter one. It's saying there should be a provider scope widget at the top of the widget tree. And in fact, we can actually go quick fix and add it. So it automatically adds it. Now we do have to import it. So we'll do control space and hope we get the import. There we go. I'm just going to move this here because I know it will be more efficient to be here, but we don't have the linter for that because we just turned it off. Okay, so we have provider scope at the top. Now, in here, we're going to have a body. In the body, we're going to have just a center tag. We're going to go child, elevated button. This is just for us to test some things here. Temporary code, but nothing wrong with that. And its child is going to be, we'll just say test create account. All right, so let's just see how this looks in our app. There we have this nice button here, test create account. Doesn't do anything yet. Now, what I'm going to do is actually wrap this whole scaffold in a builder, but we're going to change this builder to a consumer. And this is essentially a riverpod consumer. It comes from the riverpod package. And in the builder, instead of it just being context, we also have access to ref, that lovely thing that lets us talk to providers. And we have access to child, which we're not going to get into now. And we don't need it, so we're just going to do an underscore there because we don't care about it. And in here now, we can do something like ref.read, and we can take our auth service provider. And now we can call things like the register with email. And for purpose of testing, we're just going to do tyler@tylersavory.com. And for password, we're just going to use a fake little development password. And for username, I'll just be Tyler. So let's just try this out now. So this should, in theory, register us an account. Let's make this a bit bigger. I'm going to restart the backend server. Not sure if we need to. We probably didn't make any changes, but just to be safe. And we'll go back to our app. And now we see test create account. Nothing seemed to happen there. Let's see what our debug console says. Okay, it says on tap. We might have to do a green arrow rebuild actually because we put the provider scope around. That's totally what probably happened. Okay, here we go. Failed call. Unable to, unable to establish connection on channel. Interesting. What is our terminal saying? We are running it. All right, we're missing one thing. One sec. So I'm actually just doing a full rebuild. I did see the word platform channel error, which generally means the native code we haven't rebuilt since something changed in the native code. And that's what I'm guessing is the problem. It could have been, installing riverpod. Maybe there's something native. Maybe it was with fpdart. Maybe we just did something weird. But I'm just did a stop and just a full, rebuild. Okay, we're restarted, and let's just try it again. Hopefully it's good. Okay, I didn't see that error this time. And look, we got a code back. Awesome. So basically what happened there, we created the account request in our server.dart right here. We're actually getting, look, code printing out. So we're getting the validation error email right here. Now, in order to test this, we, of course, would need some UI to take it. But we can just kind of hack that for our testing purposes for today to wrap this video out. So I'm going to just copy this, comment it out, and we'll do ref.read, and we'll do validation, confirm email register. And here we need to pass in a verification code, and I'm going to hard code this code right here that we just got back. Save this, let's add a comma, and let's go click this button again. And now we should see everything went. Okay, cool. Serverpod auth email created. We don't have login yet, so we can't fully, test to make sure it worked, but we can get a good idea by using a SQL client to see. So I can go, I'm using something called dbbeaver. Oops, dbbeaver. Is that what it's called? Yeah, there it is. dbbeaver, sorry. This is a great app because it's free, completely free, open source. It's not as good as some paid ones, like for instance, DataGrip is an amazing piece of software. It's made by JetBrains, people that make the Android Studio and a bunch of other great IDEs. They're awesome. But in here, this is just free, so I wanted to use this one, and because it's just low barrier to entry, you don't have to pay a bunch of money. So in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new connection. And this is going to allow us sort of test things as we go and make sure our database data is there and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to pick Postgres. Here, we're going to look back over in our server code. And specifically in the config folder, there is a development.yaml. And if we scroll down, we're going to see database. So we can see the host is localhost, so that's all fine. The name of the database is actually called OpenMic. The port, and this will be not the default port, they're using 8090. And that's cool. And then for our username, Postgres is fine, but we also need to put a password in. And the password is actually going to be in our passwords.yaml. This is just for local. It's all good. You can take my database password. I don't care. Here it is. We're going to copy in development database password and paste it into here. We're going to save it. Let's click test connection. Connected. Okay, we're good. We'll click finish. We'll double click on this into databases, and we'll see the OpenMic database. We'll see the schema. And here's all of our different tables. And for instance, we can look at the user info table. And if we click this data tab right here, and I know this is a little bit small in the in the recording, there's no way for me to zoom this in this app. So bear with me, at least that I know of. I'll try one more time. Okay, we can make this part bigger, but it's not really the whole thing. Yeah, we can see my user was made. There's my user identity. There's my username. There's the email. That's when it's created. I have an image URL. That's kind of cool. Let's see what that is. So Serverpod also just auto-generates images for you and serves them from this little built-in web server. And cool, I got a little T because my name starts with a T. Awesome. That's fun. We're eventually going to have people uploading their own photos, but that's just a nice little feature that it comes with. Anyways, it's all working. We're good. We have not all of Auth done. We need to do login. We need to do log out. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. But I think this was great for the first, chapter 1. If the first one was chapter 0 in our programming humor, I think this is a great chapter 1, and I hope you've enjoyed it so far, and I look forward to the next one. So take care and have a great day.